Okay, welcome to another video in deploying Azure resources using Bicep. My name is Chris Jupp. I'm an Azure consultant with Visual. I'm joined by my colleague Wayne Bellows, who's also an Azure consultant with Visual. In our last video, Wayne introduced me to Bicep. Now I'm ready to learn some more. So Wayne, what are we going to cover today?
Yep, so today we'll be looking at conditions and loops. So looking at conditions, so I deploy resources conditionally, and looking at conditions that depend on each other and how to deploy those. And then we'll look at a few different loops. You've got your copy loops, you've got a loop based on account, and then there's a loop which accesses the iteration index in an array, and then we'll look at filter items with loops. So we'll go through these, sort of look at what each one is, and looking at an example of each to try and explain it a bit better.
Excellent. I'm looking forward to it. So we're going to start with conditions. So I assume this is about where we deploy the same, or we don't deploy the same resources all the time. We just deploy them in certain circumstances.
Yeah, that's right. So yeah, what we'll be looking at is conditions. So you can use conditions in your Bicep code to deploy resources only when specific constraints are in place. So it's great if you have a production environment and a development environment where you want more expensive resources, for instance, in your production environment. So when you're creating like an app service or a storage account, you may or may not want to use a private link. So you can configure your Bicep code to only deploy private link if it's needed, or if you're deploying virtual machines, you may or may not want a shutdown schedule for the VM. And you can use the one template for sort of either scenario and just specify via a condition if you need a resource or not.
Those are certainly things I've experienced when deploying resources in Azure. That sounds very useful. We have a look at a few examples. How do we implement these conditions in our code?
Sure, let's have a look at one. So when you deploy a resource in Bicep, you can provide the if keyword followed by a condition. So this example only creates a storage account if the parameter deploy storage account is equal to true. So we're using a Boolean parameter type, so the parameter can be either true or false.
Right. Okay, I see the condition on the storage account, and so it should only be created if the parameter is set to true. So where would you set that true or false parameter? Is that from a parent Bicep file, or is it passed in as a parameter when we execute the command line or the PowerShell script to go and deploy resources?
Yeah, you've got a few different options at this point, really. I mean, you could use this code on the screen as a module, and then call this module from your parent Bicep file and pass in the parameter when you call the module. Or you could use a parameter file, which lists all of the parameters when you go to deploy it, or when you come to deploy it, if you're deploying it via PowerShell or Azure CLI, you can specify the parameter value at that point as well. So it depends on how you're working and what preference you have, really.
Right, I see. Thank you.
So you can also include expressions in your conditions, so the parameter is further evaluated, not just true or false as in the previous example. So we have an environment name parameter with an allowed value of either production or development. Mm-hmm. We then have an if statement in the auditing settings resource that uses the environment name parameter and states only deploy the resource if the environment is production.
Okay, yeah, I mean, that makes sense. So is that what that equals syntax means? That means evaluate the parameter and do something if it's a certain value.
Yeah, exactly that. So you can see here, so it says if, and then environment name, which we're calling the parameter, and then we're specifying double equal sign saying that if environment name equals production, then do the following. So in this case, it would be to deploy auditing settings.
Right. Okay.
And then what we can do, we can simplify this even further to make it more readable for anyone else who will be using your template by using a variable and using the variable in the condition. So we can declare the environment name in the variable, auditing enabled to production, and then change the if statement to reference this variable. So this does the same thing as referencing the parameter in the if statement, but is cleaner and more readable. So you're really just moving that that bit of code from the resource up into a variable to try and make it a bit more readable, and you can reuse that variable throughout your code then if you need to reference that in other resources.
Right. I see. Yeah, it certainly looks more readable on the whole.
Yeah, especially when you've got 3, 4, 5 resources all in the same file, all sort of referencing that same bit of code, then it's a lot easier to reference the variable than to have that written in for every resource.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
So if we have a look at depend on conditionally deployed resources, so when you deploy resources conditionally, you sometimes need to be aware of how Bicep evaluates the dependencies between them. So in this example, we're creating a storage account if the environment is production and deploying auditing settings using the storage account if the environment is production.
Right. I think there's a lot to describe here. There's a lot on the screen, isn't there? Well, let's start at the top. You've used a unique string at the top, which is referencing the resource group ID. What's that doing?
Yeah, so yeah, there's a bit of code on the screen here. So if we walk through it, so the unique string at the top there, so this is for the audit storage account name. So the thing about storage accounts is that they need a unique name, which is a global unique name. So it can be tricky sometimes in code to come up with a way of doing this. But the unique string is an expression which can be used to provide globally unique names for resources. So instead of making the global unique name the problem of the person deploying your Bicep template, you can use this expression as a value for a storage account name.
Yeah,
So
that sounds really useful. It is quite frustrating sometimes, isn't it, to come up with those names?
Yeah, especially if you're put on the spot and you need to come up with a name, it can be a bit challenging. So the unique string function is really handy when you're creating unique resource names. It takes a seed value and basically means that when you provide the same seed value, you get the same value back. But if you provide a different seed value, you'll get a different value back. In this example, we're using the resource group .id as the seed value. This provides the resource ID of the resource group as the seed. So the resource group ID is a really good value to use as the seed, because anytime we use it, we get the same seed value. If we change the resource group name, the resource group ID will change. Again, if we choose a resource group with the same name but in a different subscription, the resource group ID is different. So that's really convenient because if we deploy in different places, we get a different value. But if we deploy over and over again from the same place, we get the same value, meaning we don't get any issues recreating our resources if we're redeploying this same script over and over again.
Right.
So the unique names provided by this function aren't very meaningful or descriptive. So what you can do is use string interpolation to concatenate the names into a more meaningful name that potentially complies with your naming convention.
Right. That certainly sounds useful. Okay, so I think I understand that. So here we're only going to deploy a storage account and the audit settings if the environment name is production. And when those audit settings are deployed, they depend on the storage account to be deployed, because down at the bottom we can see that they're referencing the audit storage account properties. In this case, the primary endpoints blob setting.
Yeah, that's right. So the audit settings will only get created if the storage account gets created, which depends on which environment it is. So if it's production, then yeah, both will get created. But the audit settings are referencing the storage account above it. So it's using the symbolic name, the audit storage account, and it's accessing the properties of that storage account.
Right.
So yeah, you can see it's got properties.primary endpoint.blob. So it's getting that value from the already deployed storage account above it.
Right. Okay. So if we passed in the environment name parameter as development, for example, from our calling script or parent Bicep file, then we wouldn't get either a storage account or inevitably the audit settings.
Yeah, that's correct. So yeah, if you pass in the parameter of development, then yeah, it will run through the condition there and say that these resources don't need to be deployed.
Okay. What happens if we pass in a parameter that isn't allowed?
It will come up with an error message saying the only allowed parameters are production and development. Please specify one of these. Yeah.
Okay, good.
Okay. But yeah, there is a gotcha with this where the audit settings using the code that's on the screen doesn't actually work, because I tried this and I was getting some error messages. So what you have to do is the issues with the storage endpoint and the storage account access key properties and referencing the already deployed storage account. So the issue is the auditing settings resource won't be able to find the storage account in the environment if the environment's development. So it's strange because the auditing settings shouldn't deploy if the environment is development. But it seems to be an issue in the backend ARM template that gets deployed when you deploy your Bicep template. So it's to make the template work, you need to add some more conditioning to the storage endpoint and the storage account access key properties. So in this example, we have additional conditioning and will function as expected.
Well, that's good that there's a workaround. And it looks like you're introducing us to another new piece of syntax here, the question mark and the colon. Let me guess. So I think in PowerShell, the question mark is used as a where operator. Is this something like that?
But it's more of an if-else condition, I guess. So what we've done is add a condition to say if the environment is production, then configure the auditing settings. If the environment isn't production, then do nothing. So anything after the question mark will get done if the condition is true, and anything after the colons will get done if the condition is false.
Right, I understand. Okay, that's quite a comprehensive overview of conditions, I think. So we're going to look at loops next. So again, I guess this involves deploying multiples of the same thing. Right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so we can use the same bit of code basically to create multiples of a resource rather than duplicating our work. So yeah, loops. So often when you're deploying to Azure, you need to deploy multiple resources that are very similar. So this could be multiple storage accounts, virtual networks, VMs, and we can use a loop to go through and deploy the resources. So loops will save you from typing your code out more than once. Instead of having separate code to create 4 storage accounts, you can use one bit of code in a loop to deploy the 4 storage accounts. So this makes the code easier to read and understand, and can make your code more flexible and save time when writing the code, and could potentially be deployed many times to create additional storage accounts.
Oh, great. Let's have a look at some detail then.
Yeah, so if we start with a copy loop, we want to create, in this example, 3 storage accounts, which you can see in the first screenshot there. So we could repeat the storage account creation code 3 times, but this is insufficient. For the storage account names parameter, we use an array with as many storage account names in it as we need to deploy. But for our example, it's got 3 in. So you create your for loop in the same place where we created our conditions. So after the resource type API and equal sign, you add a square brackets and use the keyword for and make up a name to be used. So it can be anything, but it's going to make sense to use something meaningful for the resource. And then use the keyword in followed by a parameter. So in this example, we use storage account name in storage account names.
I mean, that makes sense. One storage account in a list of storage account names.
Yeah, and then we just need to remember to include the closing square loop at the end of the resource to close the loop.
Yeah, I can see that it'd be easy to forget that. Does Visual Studio Code, you were talking about the wonders of Visual Studio Code last time, does that do that for you?
Yeah, it's really good actually. So if you are using Visual Studio Code, which I highly recommend, it can create the loops for you when you go to create your resource. So if you just start typing for, so IntelliSense will pop up and give you some options. So if you want a for loop, just press enter, and then it will insert the syntax for you.
Brilliant. So do I need to list out each item individually in my array in order to do that multiple deploy?
No, there are other ways to do it, which we'll come on to in the loop based on account. So you might sometimes need to loop to create a specific number of resources and not to use an array as the source. You can use the range function to achieve this in Bicep. This is very handy when you need to create a specific number of resources, like creating 4 storage accounts with the same settings, but you want their names to be, for example, SA1, 2, 3, and 4. So the syntax for this loop is similar to the copy loop. So you use the keyword for again, but then instead of a letter, but you then use a letter. This can be anything, but it's good practice to use I to represent an integer, and then use the range function. So when you use the range function, you provide 2 arguments. So the first specifies the starting value, and the second tells Bicep the number of values that you want. So for example, if you use range 1, 4, as you can see in the slide, then Bicep will return the values 1, 2, 3, and 4, creating 4 storage accounts.
Right.
So because a storage account needs a unique name, you use the loop in the name. So you specify this by using the I that we declared in the for loop above.
Right, I see. So therefore, because the value of I is changing on each loop, it gives you a unique number to use in that name parameter.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, that's great. So are there any other types of loop that we need to look at?
Yeah, there's another one which you can use called access the iteration index. So with Bicep, you can iterate through arrays and retrieve the index of the current element in the array, as well as the name of the item. So in this example, we have SQL servers in 3 different locations, and we want each of them to have a unique name. We use a for loop to loop through the locations array. This bit we've already walked through. So we can use the position index of the location in the array to create a unique value. So remember that arrays start at 0. So for example, UK South is in position 0, so its SQL server name would be SQL server -0. Then the next location in the array is UK West, which is in position 1, so its SQL server name would be SQL server -1. If we look at the code, we can see you can have 2 entries in the for loop. So you've got the location will loop through the location for the location property, and the I loops through the iteration index for the position in the array. And you can just separate the location and the I with a comma. You then use the I on the end of the name property in the resource to create that unique name. So because the iteration loop always starts at 0 and we want our SQL server names to start at 1, we're adding a +1 to the I value. So in UK South, we'll get a SQL server with the name SQL server -1.
Yeah, combining the two together. Great. So the next obvious question then is, how do we combine loops and conditions? Can we combine loops and conditions? We must be able to.
You certainly can, yes. So yeah, it's if you can combine the both to make some really powerful code. So if we have a look at this one, so this is filter items with loops. So in some situations, you might want to deploy resources by using loops combined with conditions. So for example, you could deploy resources from a list, but only a subset of them. So you filter them, so you're only deploying the ones you want. This is the combination of the two concepts that we've been looking at. So we're combining conditions and loops here. So we start off with a parameter that has an array in it. And this array, instead of being filled with strings, it's filled with objects. These objects we can use in our loop. We can see from the array that we have 3 objects for 3 SQL servers. The objects contain the properties SQL server name, location, and environment name. And we can use these properties to fill in the properties in the SQL server resources. So the for loop would look the same as what we've already been through. In this example, we have for SQL server in SQL server details. Then for the resource properties, we use SQL server.property. So the name would be SQL server.name, the location would be SQL server.location, and the tag for the environment would be SQL server.environment name. So this code would create 3 SQL servers with the details from the individual objects in the array. You can add additional objects into the array to create additional SQL servers. So if somebody later down the line wants to add another SQL server using the same code, they would just add that on to the parameter to deploy it. Now what we can do is add a condition in the form of an if statement, which we've already looked at. So if you only wanted to deploy the SQL server in the environment, if the environment was production, you just need to add the condition syntax after the for loop details. So this code will iterate through each of the servers in the server details array and only deploy them if the environment name is set to production. So the outcome will be that the SQL servers SQL server -we and SQL server -eas will get deployed. But because SQL server -eu s2 is in the development, it will not be deployed.
Great. That's just what I've been looking for. I suppose another example which leaps to my mind is in development we might just want one VM or one storage account, but in production we might need 5, 10, 15, hundreds even, but maybe not. But yeah, that sounds like a very powerful deployment tool.
Yeah, there's lots of scenarios you can use it in. I think do a few examples and you kind of get used to it, and then you can start mixing conditions and loops together, and yeah, before you know it, you'll be deploying lots of loops and conditions all over your code.
So I'll let you know how I get on.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Wayne. That's been another extremely useful session. I've learned a lot. So have you written a blog about this one as well?
It's in development. Yeah, I've started writing it. It will be up on visual.com/blogs shortly, when you can have a read through it, as well as all the other fantastic blogs up there as well.
I'll do that.
True.
I'll do that. Thanks very much. See you all again. Bye for now.
Bye.